This morning we're continuing on in our series in Daniel. Got another good-sized chunk of the story to read today. Daniel chapter 4, verses 1 to 27. It reads, King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream, interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, Cut down the tree and trim off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground and the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of people. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men of my kingdom can interpret it for me. But you can, because of the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Belteshazzar answered, My lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies, and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. Your majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. Your majesty saw a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven and saying, Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field, while its roots remain in the ground. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. This is the interpretation, your majesty, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So when our daughter Haley was little, about 3 or 4 years old, she was constantly being told how pretty she was. No matter if we were at the grocery store, the park, the mall, wherever we were, somebody would stop us to compliment her on how pretty she was. Which in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with. She was, and she still is, a very pretty girl. The problem came about when all of it went to her head. She would constantly talk about how pretty she was. She would fish around for us to comment on how pretty she was. And we even had her preschool teacher talk to us one time about the fact that Haley told one of her classmates that they weren't pretty. We, of course, made her apologize to the other child for that rude comment. She had been told so many times that she was pretty that she, in her formative young years, became overly focused on outward beauty. Now, I don't blame Haley for this, right? She was little, and she didn't know any better at the time. But this story is an excellent illustration of how quickly people can fall into a spirit of pride, to become arrogant and boastful about all the good things we have in life, to give ourselves the credit for these good things rather than giving glory to whom it belongs, God. Pride's easy. It's so easy to slip into a boastful attitude about what we have, about what we've accomplished. Humility's hard. It's much harder to not take the credit for the good things in our lives, but to give credit to God alone for his blessings. And pride is exactly what we're dealing with in this passage. The pride of Nebuchadnezzar, as he's very boastful, he's very arrogant about his accomplishments as a ruler. And that is contrasted with the humility of Daniel, who knows that all he has and all that he's accomplished is because of God's blessing and provision. Remember where we're at in the book of Daniel right now. So far, we've seen Nebuchadnezzar encountered with the authority, power, and glory of God multiple times, right? He saw that God has the power to make Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah healthier and stronger than all the other young men, even though they only consumed vegetables and water. He's seen God can place dreams in his mind, like the dream of the statue. He's seen that God has given Daniel the ability to tell him what his dream is and interpret it for him. And he's seen God has the power to save, right? He watched God protect Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar hadn't just heard about these things, right? He's seen them. He's been a witness to God's power on more than one occasion, but he's still consumed with a prideful spirit. He still carries on in wickedness and oppression. So God once again gives Nebuchadnezzar a vision and a dream, a warning of what's to come if he continues on in his wicked ways. This dream of a tree and then the interpretation likely took place toward the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. We can assume that because a different ruler named Belshazzar is mentioned in chapter 5. So we're getting to the end of Nebuchadnezzar's time as king. This dream and its interpretation, we also see, is the last recorded encounter between Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, and God. Further, we see from verse 1 that this chapter is a royal letter from Nebuchadnezzar to his subjects. Nebuchadnezzar wrote this to his people to witness to the works that God has done. And he writes this letter as a way to kind of explain why he's giving deference to the God of these Jewish captives. And what we see from this royal letter is a warning against pride. What Nebuchadnezzar's second dream and its interpretation teaches us is that because of pride, we must remember that it is God who is in control of all things. We must understand that God is quick to humble the proud, and we must strive to be faithful to God in all things and do what's right in his eyes. So first, let's consider what this passage teaches us about the fact that God's in control of all things. And remember, this is an extremely important point because, as we've talked about previously, it's the central theme of the book of Daniel. The reason why the book was written in the first place was to remind God's people in exile that he was still in control, and he was still working all things according to his plan. So in order for us to truly understand what this book has to teach us, especially in a few weeks when we get into the more difficult prophetic chapters, if we want to understand that, we have to keep the original purpose of the book at the forefront of our minds. And the fact that God is in control is the main message of the book, and it's all over this passage today. First, we see the fact that God's in control from the very mouth of Nebuchadnezzar himself in verses 2 and 3. Nebuchadnezzar says that it is his pleasure to tell the people about the signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for him. And by referring to God as the Most High God, Nebuchadnezzar is affirming that the Jewish God is greater, is more powerful than the Babylonian gods. Then in verse 3, Nebuchadnezzar gives a wonderful doxology about God. This is what he says, quote, "How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation." In this doxology, Nebuchadnezzar is acknowledging the miraculous abilities of God, of the God of the Jews. Also, in stating that God's kingdom is an eternal kingdom and his dominion endures, Nebuchadnezzar is acknowledging that the Jewish God alone, not any Babylonian gods, the Jewish God alone was sovereign over all things. So here we have Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful, the most influential man in the world at the time, becoming a faithful witness of the true God. The events of the first 4 chapters, whether it's eating the vegetables and water, or the dream of the statue, or the fiery furnace, those events have shown Nebuchadnezzar that God has the authority to set up kings and kingdoms and to tear them down. That heaven and earth are at his beck and call. That his kingdom will never pass away, but is eternal. That he has dominion over all things, and that his dominion will continue, even as generations rise and fade away. That's a pretty clear statement from Nebuchadnezzar that God's in control. And we see further evidence of the fact that God's in sovereign control in verses 8, 9, and then down in 18. As Nebuchadnezzar says that Belteshazzar, or Daniel, has the spirit of the holy gods in him and no mystery is too difficult for him. He says that 3 different times in these verses. And in that statement, Nebuchadnezzar is acknowledging that Daniel's ability to understand and interpret dreams comes not from within himself, but from God. While stating that Daniel has the spirit of the holy gods, plural, and referring to Daniel by his pagan Babylonian name rather than his true Jewish name, that shows that Nebuchadnezzar still hasn't gotten everything figured out, right? This statement still shows that he at least understands that Daniel's God is higher than any other gods, and is able to do things that these other gods can't do. And he understands that Daniel has been gifted with his abilities by God. In other words, he's finally coming to acknowledge that Daniel's God, the God of the Jews, the true God, is in sovereign control. Finally, in the second half of verse 25 and then all of verse 26, as Daniel's interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream for him, he says this, "7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules." So in that, Daniel's letting Nebuchadnezzar know that he has to acknowledge, he has to understand, and he has to accept that God's in control. That God has the power and the authority to give kingdoms to whom he wishes and to take them away from whom he wishes. Daniel's saying that Nebuchadnezzar must understand that he's not king, nor has he accomplished all that he has as a ruler because of his own strength or power or ability, but because God has given him the kingdom and allowed him to rule. That's confirmed when Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that his kingdom won't be restored back to him until he acknowledges that heaven rules. God's going to take the kingdom away from Nebuchadnezzar, and he's not going to give it back until Nebuchadnezzar understands that even though he's the king of the greatest empire in the world, both he and his empire are under the sovereign authority of God. Again, we have a clear statement of God's sovereignty, that he is in control. And God's sovereignty, the fact that he's in control of all things in both the spiritual realm and the physical realm, is so important for us to remember. Right? It's God's sovereignty that makes him God. If things happened outside of God's authority and control, would he really be God? If things happened that he could do nothing about, would he be God? I submit to you that he wouldn't. But he is sovereign. He is in control. And he is God. And there's evidence of that fact all over the place. You know, some people think that miracles don't happen in the world anymore. That God, for whatever reason, is no longer in the business of performing miracles. Now, I'm not up here today to get into a discussion of miracles. That's another discussion. But miracles are one of the surest pieces of evidence that God's in control. Because it's in miracles that he intentionally, physically intervenes in the events of the world to accomplish a purpose. Let me share a story with you of what seems to be a modern-day miracle that made news around the country, and see what you think about it. In March 2015, Officer Tyler Beddoes and his fellow police officers were dispatched to an overturned car in the Spanish Fork River in Utah, which they believed had no one inside. An article on faithwire.com explains what happens next. I'm going to read it for you. It says, quote, "When Beddoes and his fellow officers reached the scene and started walking down the riverbank toward the overturned vehicle, they all simultaneously heard a clear and distinct voice. We all heard an adult female voice, which was a calm voice saying, 'Help me, help me,'" he recalled. "This voice really guided us to the car and gave us hope that whoever was calling out was alive. But here's the crazy part. Once the officers reached the vehicle, they quickly realized that the adult female inside had been deceased for quite some time. Later, they found out she died on impact 14 hours earlier. That said, the woman's daughter, an 18-month-old baby named Lily, was still alive yet unconscious in the backseat of the vehicle. We realized, okay, Lily had been upside down in an overturned car in freezing temperatures for 14 hours, with the only company being her dead mother. It was the question of that voice, though, that persisted, as there was no natural explanation surrounding who was calling out to the officers for help. They all clearly heard the voice, though there were no other people around at the scene when they arrived, eventually leading Beddoes to conclude that the only explanation was divine intervention. Lily's mother, Jennifer, had been killed on impact. Lily had been unconscious in a freezing state and couldn't have spoken those words, he said. I know that angels are messengers and protectors. I have no doubt that we were guided by an angel that had stayed to assure Lily was safe until rescuers arrived," unquote. That certainly sounds like the work of a sovereign God who's in control. That in his divine authority, he determined it was not time for Lily to pass away. Doesn't that sound like that to you? It sounds like that to me. If our God has so much authority and has so much control over all things that he can intervene miraculously in the events of history, he can alter things beyond human control and understanding as he sees fit, then we most certainly need to believe and trust that he's in control. And we must learn to let go and stop trying to do everything in our own power. We need to understand that we are woefully inadequate and incapable of determining the course of our lives. So why should we try? Why do we feel like we have to do everything? We have to solve every problem. We have to fix every issue. We have to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Why do we think that we need to do it? Why do we think we have the ability to do it? Why do we think we get to decide where we go or what we do or how we act? Why do we think that we have the ability to fix problems in our lives? More importantly than why do we think it, why do we want to do it? We have the sovereign God of the universe, who we've seen miraculously intervene in the history of the world thousands of times. And he's saying, trust me. Let me show you where to go. Let me show you what to do. Let me show you how to solve this problem. Let me provide for you. Let me take care for you. And we have the audacity to think, no, God, I'm good. I got this. You stay over there and let me handle this, because I know what to do. I know how to take care of things. You go handle something more important. Let me deal with myself. Why do we do that? When we've got God saying, let me take it. Let me take this burden from you. Let me show you where I want you to go, where you're going to be blessed and where you're going to be a blessing to others. We need to surrender ourselves to God. We need to surrender our problems to God. We need to surrender everything to God and say, God, you are infinitely more capable than I am, so I'm trusting in you. Yeah, I'll work. Tell me what you want me to do and I'll go to work, but I understand that I'm only accomplishing what you've given me the ability to accomplish. I'm only doing what you've given me the ability to do. There's nothing in this world that we can accomplish on our own. If we try to accomplish it on our own, we're going to fail time and time and time again, because we are weak, we are incapable, and I'm just going to be frank with you, we're pretty dumb. But God is infinitely wise and capable and strong, and he has all the ability in the world, so we need to let him be Lord of our life and show us where he wants us to go, what he wants us to do. Second, let's consider what our passage teaches us about God being quick to humble the proud. Notice what Nebuchadnezzar says about himself in verse 4. He says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. Nebuchadnezzar, as we noted earlier, was likely in the final few years of his reign. And he seemed to be quite pleased with himself, with the empire he had built and the wealth he had amassed. In fact, the word that the NIV translates as prosperous could also be transliterated as flourishing, or even more telling, could be transliterated as luxuriant. Nebuchadnezzar was content. He was comfortable. He was reveling in his wealth and power. In a word, he was being prideful. And he goes on in verse 5 to tell us that as he was contented, as he was flourishing and luxuriant, as he was full of pride for all that he accomplished, God intervened in his life by giving him a nightmare to remember. A nightmare that would cause him great trepidation. And then he goes on to give us an account of this nightmare. And it's in Daniel's interpretation of this nightmare that we see the explicit evidence of the fact that God humbles the proud. Right? Just as Nebuchadnezzar was feeling good about himself and his kingdom, just as he was saying, I got all this king stuff figured out, God showed him that it would all be taken away from him because of his pride. The nightmare was a metaphor detailing exactly how God was going to humble Nebuchadnezzar, how he was going to get Nebuchadnezzar to acknowledge his pride and repent. The vision in the nightmare begins on a happy enough note, right? Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that he is the large and strong tree, that his kingdom has reached heights of power and wealth and influence and success unlike anything the world had ever known before. So it starts off pretty good. Hey, yeah, I'm this big strong tree. My kingdom is awesome. But this vision wasn't a vision of happiness and prosperity. The next part of the vision proves that for us, because an angel comes down from heaven and pronounces a decree against Nebuchadnezzar on behalf of God, as Daniel says in verse 24. When the messenger commands that the tree be cut down and destroyed, that's the metaphor for Nebuchadnezzar being driven away from the people and living like a wild animal, as Daniel notes in verse 25. This gives us the impression that Nebuchadnezzar was removed from the throne in some form or fashion. And after this happens, we're told he will become like an animal, living among the animals, eating grass, being drenched by the morning dew. But after commanding the tree to be cut down, the angel says, leave the stump with the iron and bronze bindings and its roots still in the ground, which shows that God didn't command this to be the final outcome for Nebuchadnezzar, but to be a punishment for his wickedness that would last 7 times. And that phrase 7 times refers to 7 periods of time, the length of which we don't know. Traditionally speaking, 7 times has been interpreted to mean 7 years. But there's no way to know that's what it means for certain, because nowhere in Scripture does it say that a time equals a year. So it could mean 7 years, or it could mean 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 seasons, or any other period of time. We don't know exactly the length of time, but in any event, after Nebuchadnezzar spends this appointed time enduring this punishment, he will acknowledge that heaven rules and God's in control, and he will be restored to his position as king of Babylon. Pride is chief among the sins, and it is dangerous. C.S. Lewis says that all other sins are mere flea bites in comparison to pride. There's an old saying that goes, pride comes before the fall. And that saying's quite apropos, but I would change it to, God humbles the proud. One somewhat recent example of pride that led to a spectacular fall is the story of Enron, right? The energy trading company founded in 1985. The company's COO created this insanely competitive environment where money was God. And it didn't matter if you were being moral or ethical or lawful in order to get it. The company, though, was actually not doing well, but they still utilized some false accounting practices to cover up their losses, to defraud their investors, and to line their own pockets. But when the boom economy came to an end and Enron's competition increased, the losses became larger and larger. So they had to become even more strategic about covering their losses in order to continue to defraud investors and to cover up their misdeeds. Eventually, though, all of these misdeeds came to light when Enron was forced to file bankruptcy with losses estimated at $74 billion. Many of the executives were prosecuted and sentenced, and the company was forced to pay $85 million in a settlement with former employees. Right? You can look at that story. I'm sure everybody heard it. It was a huge story when it happened. That is an example of pride. The pride of the leaders of the company kept them from being honest about the company's failings. Instead, they chose to do anything and everything to save face and pretend like everything was okay. And they were eventually humbled for that pride quite severely. Pride's such a dangerous thing, which is why we must constantly be on guard against it in our own lives and strive to stay humble. And when we do that by acknowledging that we are nothing without God, we keep a spirit of pride away by acknowledging that we are nothing without God, by giving Him His proper credit, by giving Him His proper due in our lives, by understanding that nothing we have, nothing we are, nothing we accomplish is because of us, but because of His blessings to us and work through us. Nothing we have is because of us. Every cent you've ever earned is because God blessed you. Every piece of clothing you've bought is because God blessed you. Every morsel of food you've eaten is because God blessed you. You're sitting there right now inhaling oxygen into your lungs because God is blessing you. When we have that mentality, when we have that understanding that there is nothing in our life that comes outside of the blessing of God, that keeps us humble. What do we have to be proud of if everything has been given to us by God? If every second of our life is a gift from God, what do we have to be proud about? I submit to you nothing. Because we are nothing without God. And that's why it's important that we are humble, that we don't put ourselves on a pedestal and act like we're the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's so important that we don't elevate ourselves above others and look down on them. Just because God has blessed you abundantly, and maybe someone else hasn't experienced the blessings that you have, doesn't mean you're better than them. Doesn't mean God loves you more than them. Doesn't mean you have any more value than they do. We elevate ourselves based on what we have or how much money we earn or what part of town we live in. Whatever the case may be, all these ways we elevate ourselves and think that we're better than other people when we're not. Because all that they have is a blessing from God. All that we have is a blessing from God. God created them just the same way God created us. Jesus died for them the same way Jesus died for us. The only way they're getting to heaven is a relationship with Jesus. The only way we're getting to heaven is a relationship with Jesus. There's no difference between us other than materialistic things. And all that we have is a gift from God one way or the other. So we don't need to elevate ourselves above other people. We need to thank God for how much He's blessed us and then use those blessings to bless that person that's beneath us rather than look down on them. Man, God, you've blessed me so much. Thank you for blessing me in such a way that I can be a blessing to somebody else. That's the mentality we need to have. Finally, let's consider what our passage teaches us about striving to be faithful to God in all things and do what's right in His eyes. In verse 19, we're told that once Nebuchadnezzar told Daniel his dream, Daniel was greatly perplexed or astonished, and his thoughts terrified him. Daniel doesn't want to tell the king what his dream meant. He's afraid. Afraid for Nebuchadnezzar because he seemed to genuinely like the guy. He's afraid of what Nebuchadnezzar's downfall might mean for the Babylonian Empire, afraid of what it might mean for his fellow Jews in captivity, afraid that Nebuchadnezzar might get upset at this revelation and take it out on him by demoting, imprisoning, or even killing him. We can't know for sure exactly what it was that terrified Daniel, but given that he was human with complex thoughts, just like all of us, it was probably all of these things. He probably had all of these thoughts swirling around in his head. If I tell the king what this means, we're all in a bunch of trouble. No matter what he was feeling, though, Daniel, in his humility, his deference to God as the ruler of his life, was faithful by interpreting the dream. Right? Daniel could have put his pride first and decided to look out for number one. I'm not telling him what the dream means so I don't get in trouble. But instead, he humbled himself. He was faithful to what God had called him to do, even though he didn't want to do it. Then in verse 27, Daniel tries to keep Nebuchadnezzar from experiencing this judgment. He implores him to renounce his sins by doing what's right, and to renounce his wickedness by being kind to the oppressed, so that his prosperity might continue. Right? That's a call to humility. Nebuchadnezzar had elevated himself to a position of such power, he thought so highly of himself that he was in danger of the temptation to think himself a god. He certainly attempted to put himself on the same level as God on more than one occasion. So Daniel is saying that if he humbles himself and admits that it is God who truly has authority, who truly rules, if he quits trying to put himself on God's level and test him, if he humbles himself further by using his power and wealth to help the weak and oppressed, then he won't have to endure what this nightmare has foretold. Daniel was calling Nebuchadnezzar to the same humility and faith in God that he had in his own life, and we're called to it as well. There will be plenty of times in our lives that God calls us to do something that we just flat out don't want to do. Just like Daniel didn't want to have to interpret the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't want to humble himself and submit to the authority of God. But it's precisely in these moments that we don't want to follow God, that we don't want to do what he's asking of us, that it's the most crucial that we do follow him and do what he's commanded. It's crucial because it keeps us from being self-focused and self-centered and keeps us focused on God, which then helps us from becoming prideful. Right? If God is calling you to do something and you don't want to do it, but you suck it up and do it, that helps you remember that he's on the throne of your life and you're not. The God, I don't want to go talk to my neighbor who I know is a hardcore atheist and wants nothing to do with Jesus and is just going to call me every name in the book and yell out every cuss word in the book. I don't want to do it. God, I'm not going to do it. That's putting yourself on the throne of your life, saying, God, I don't care what you want. My comfort's more important. But if you say, God, I don't want to do it, but not my will, your will be done, and you suck it up and you go knock on that neighbor's door and say, hey, I want to talk to you, then you remember, God's more important than my comfort. What he wants is more important than what I want. And I have no reason to be proud. I have no reason to think anything of myself because God's in control. He's king and I'm not. So it helps us from being self-focused, self-centered, and prideful. But second, it's crucial we do what he wants us to do, even and especially when we don't want to do it. Because when we do what we don't feel like doing, we're following God and doing the work he's commanded us to do. Even when we don't want to do it. It's in those moments that we're truly able to accomplish great things for his kingdom. When God asks you to do something hard, there's a reason. Because it's going to be important. It's going to be impactful. He wants you to talk to that neighbor that you don't want to talk to. It's because he's working on that neighbor. And maybe you going over there and knocking on the door and having a conversation is going to be the seed that God can then use to grow a tree of faith in that person's life. And isn't our comfort worth sacrificing to see somebody accept Jesus as their Savior? God calls you to quit your job and go be a missionary in Africa. And you don't want to do it because that's scary. That's a huge change. But you say, God, I'm going to do it. And then you go over there and you accomplish great things for the kingdom, providing food and education for these people and introducing them to Jesus. Isn't that worth the sacrifice? Some of the biggest and hardest things God's asked us to do is because that's where he's working the hardest. And so when we suck up our pride and we get to work, he can accomplish great things for the kingdom. God works through us. He could always intervene in the events of history miraculously. He's God. If he just wanted to always just insert himself and work miracles to accomplish his will, he could. But that's not how he's chosen to do it. He's chosen to have us, his people, get to work for him. And so we have to be willing to do it, whether we feel like it or not, whether we want to or not, whether it makes us comfortable or not. Because he's God and we're not. And ultimately, this passage proves one thing for certain. One thing for certain. Nebuchadnezzar had a nightmare to remember, and we would all do well not to forget it, but to learn from it. Hallelujah.